On this episode, I'm speaking with Thomas Herzog, principal of Good Neighbor Homes. Thomas leads the company through each of its multifamily developments, oversees property management, and interfaces directly with each of their advisory clients. He's served in multiple development and real estate consulting roles, while also overseeing over $250 million in real estate asset optimization. He believes leading with honesty, integrity, and earnestness are the keys to helping change the way people think about real estate development and property management. Without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Thomas. Thanks so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to jump in.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, if you've listened to Transforming Cities over the years, then you know that I love a good intro story, the early years, kind of where you came from, origin stories. I think they're really important for us all. So tell me a little bit about your early years and what this specific hometown was like that you grew up in, because it was pretty cool.
It was really cool for me as an 8-year-old, for sure. Today, as a 30-year-old, I'm not sure it has the same cool factor, but I was born in a small town in central Minnesota, Winsted, Minnesota, 2,000 people. I graduated in high school with, 97 people in my graduating class. So pretty small, small school. In fact, it actually took 3 separate towns for us to make up that high school class.
Wow.
Rural Minnesota. I grew up in town though. So I grew up, just off of Main Street. There was across the street, there was a park connected to a lake. A block away was kind of the classic downtown of Winsted. Had the old city hall in it, a couple bars, a bank, post office, the kind of the classics for a small town Main Street. And could pretty much, walk or bike anywhere I went as a kid, which was really great. Most of my friends lived either in town or just outside of town, so everything was bikeable. And it wasn't until our conversation that I realized that this was actually probably a really, really instrumental and formative period for me in how I live my life today. I live with many of the same features in my adult life in Minneapolis. Still biking, still walking, still enjoying that, the close connectivity of everything.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too when we were first having some intro conversations around this story, this origin story, and how so much of your work I felt like immediately tied back to this early experience and this idea of Main Street, which is, maybe a little bit of an overused phrase at this point in the small scale development world, but certainly a theme that stands very true in terms of the efforts and the thought process and the lens with which many small developers see the world. And clearly it had a big impact on you as a kid growing up, and now as a young up and coming developer. It matters, and it made a big impact on you. And I'm curious, when you think back to being a kid, and I'm a little bit older than you. I'm getting to that point now where I start to say that I'm a little bit older than you, but as a kid, I was similarly cruising around on a bike, enjoying friends around the neighborhood. My parents kind of said, "Hey, like go out, have fun, go out for a few hours, come back for dinner." Did you have a really, really similar upbringing like that? Like, were you out of the house at 9 a.m, coming back at 5 for dinner? Was it just kind of like a fun small town idyllic type of scenario for you?
Yes, in a lot of ways, I was very much a free range kid. My parents loved when we left the house and left them alone.
I got a little break.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
With a small town, there were in the early 90s and a bit into the 2000s, there was just total freedom, whether it was biking to the basketball courts or a friend's house, skating or sledding in the winter. They were pretty hands off, for better and for worse. There's some things that they could have been more hands on about, but yeah, I got to explore the world pretty much once I could bike. Outside, I could explore the world outside my own street
Mm-hmm.
on my own, which was
Yeah.
yeah, really fun.
And one of the things that you were reflecting on when we were first speaking tied back to actually some unique development that is now happening back in this town years later. And you mentioned there were actually a few different things happening, which is pretty cool because making that connection and thinking back and now looking back at that main street, what are some of the developments that have popped up and what has started to change the landscape of that town?
Yeah, yeah. Winstead is, gosh, I remember in high school, Winstead hired an outside consulting firm. I didn't know this language at the time, but there was someone hosting an event when I was in high school to do a master plan for the community. To think about our park system, our trail network, our community businesses. Stuff that I live and breathe all day long today. Um, but I remember being at that meeting and them talking about Main Street and the importance of the businesses there, and then the importance of business out on the kind of the highway that ran through town on the other side. And I think at that point, Winstead was still trying to grow and become a better version of itself. And it's now 10, 15 years later, had most of its downtown buildings receive reinvestment through a couple different eras of developers that have come in and built pizza shops and converted the old city hall to a floral and coffee shop, florist and coffee shop.
Hmm.
There's some new apartments that have been renovated on Main Street. So there's kind of the classic first floor retail and then the second floor apartment above it. There's a arts council in Winstead now that does summer programming, bringing artists to town and doing different events like that. They actually inspired me and connected me with an artist to do a public mural of a sunflower on my childhood home.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, there's a lot of really cool things. All small town, nothing overly fancy, nothing out of context, just a good old fashioned reinvestment for another generation of business and service in Winstead.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, we'll find our way back to that childhood home a little bit later in our
Yeah.
conversation because there's some great narrative around there and some great learnings for you as well. Let's transition into your teenage years and kind of headed into college. Did you know real estate was the thing back then, or were you like so many of my guests who say had no idea, headed in one direction, headed in another, ended up finding my way back into real estate. So for you, what did you find yourself heading into in terms of studies?
Yeah, I left Winstead after a good 18 years there. Went to college, University of Wisconsin Eau Claire, and just kind of immediately the doors get blown open with what's happening in the rest of the world and all of the different. At that point we called them majors, but all of the different industries that ultimately make up our economy and our society. So it was like night and day. I was like, holy cow, there's ways to specialize in business. It's not just business. It's accounting and marketing and sales and actuarial science and then there's all these subdisciplines within the sciences and within the arts. And so I basically declared as a psychology major because I knew that coming out of high school was a key focus of mine and has stayed that for a long time. But I sampled, anything and everything that I could from, intro to singing to intro to accounting to intro to religions and, everything in between was just kind of trying to take it all in. And
Okay.
and understand everything else that was out there.
Are we going to be able to catch a few bars of that intro to singing course on this podcast, or maybe for another episode, a part two?
Let's say that for part two. I like that. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned to me a course on centered around urban geography, specifically, and this came up because you mentioned the water towers on top of buildings, like this kind of iconic, water on top of a building. I wanted to say facade, but sort of silhouette that I think we've all become familiar with over the years, if you've paid attention to building structures and architecture and things like that. What was it about that experience in that urban geography class, or that experience, that maybe started to, have a little bit of a switch flipped, or a corner turned for you when it came to real estate?
Yeah, that was, I think you're totally right. That was the first class that I took at university that had environmental sustainability focus to it, but at the intersection of our built environment, like our buildings and our streets and our cities. And the professor loved to talk about his own book, which was a deep dive into the history of New York City and the way that they got indoor plumbing to work and filtered water to work in New York, which is anchored by those giant vats of water that you see sitting on top of so many, or you used to see sitting on top of so many buildings. And so I think it's that class that helped me kind of understand the what happens or the repercussions of the choices that I make with my life relative to the climate that I live in, and then also how important our buildings are in that equation of environmental sustainability. Not so much real estate yet in that class, but it was certainly the first entree into this is how cities get built and why they're important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that switch, because you had what you called kind of a click in your brain happen not too long after that. So the way the story goes is you ended up moving to Duluth for 6 months or so, and then you continued on to Minneapolis to finish school at the U of M. And you said when you had that experience at U of M, there was this click, like the switch had officially flipped and that corner was turned within that urban studies program at U of M. Why? What was the, you talked about kind of your eyes opening up and the world in front of you when you first left home, but now you're at U of M in Minneapolis. What was the click?
Yeah, the click was that urban planners draft the plan for a city, the roads, the sewers, the utilities, the rest of the utilities, the buildings, how big they can be, what uses they can be. And then it's largely left to the development community to execute on that. It's a huge swath of responsibility that is placed into the development community's hands. Is the city says, here's what we'd like. You come to us and help us, fulfill that need. And that took a while for me to get to because that Eau Claire urban geography class really got me interested in cities and how they're built and why and regional variations and the history of cities. Like all of that was incredibly fascinating. And the University of Minnesota's program in the geography department there, urban studies, was really geared towards the urban planning profession. So folks who go to work at the city or the county or go into kind of third-party consulting, engineering firms and design firms that help also build out these plans and these projects for cities. And I just, I took a couple classes continue to be fascinated by it, but it never really felt like that was what I wanted to do.
Mm.
And so it was kind of at the end of that degree that I was like, I think I actually want to go and do the work on the other side of this equation rather than be in the city and be drafting the plans. And so that was
Mm.
the kind of like, oh yeah, I should go do real estate. That should be that's what I want to do.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities, brought to you by Authentic. Authentic delivers premier multifamily brand experiences and smart digital marketing. Our proven approach aims to accelerate leasing velocity, boost rental rates, and increase long-term value. Simply put, we see brand as a business asset. You can find out more at authenticff.com. And so you graduated with a psychology degree in the end, which I think is appropriate because all of the work that you do and the way with which you look at the work that you do, it just makes sense that you have such a heightened sense of empathy for your projects, for your communities, for the renters that you have. So you went back. You said, all right, I wrapped up this thing, and then you ended up going back to U of M, doing some real estate courses, and you told me that what was fun about it in a way that's different from, when you're at like a actual, I'll say a student who's like kind of still figuring it out, is that you became so earnest and eager because you were there to absorb everything as much as possible, just like a sponge. I mean, you said to me, you were sort of showing up and seeking a direct conduit to this community, this development community, as you were learning. And I think there was a great takeaway there that had to do with those early connections that you made at the U of M and how important those are still to you today and how they've been in your career so far. Can you speak to some of those early experiences and some of those early connections that you made and why it was so pivotal for you in your career?
Yeah. So I was, I graduated college, took the job or the internship that I had gotten in my senior year, transitioned that into a full-time job, which was being a coffee sales and marketing person for a small roaster here in the cities. Did that for a couple of years while I, tried to figure out exactly how I was, going to break my way into real estate. And it's at that point where I go back and I take one more class at the U of M, Intro to Urban Real Estate Development, I think it was. And it was so, I stuck out like a sore thumb. And I think the professor would tell you this today. I was the classic older person who had gone out into the workforce, realized how, shitty it could be out there, and is like back to really learn about a very specific thing. And so, I was sitting in the front of class, showing up early, raising my hand, asking questions, staying late, asking more questions, like really trying to absorb everything that I could about this new industry that I was trying to make my way into. And it's that, that earnestness that really set me apart from the rest of my peers in that class, the other students that were taking the class who were, the kind of classic 20-year-old juniors and seniors. And even just after a few years, and a lot of clarity, I was, I stood out for how serious I was about wanting to make this a career path. And it was actually that professor who, 12 months, 15 months later, helped me get my second job within real estate, which was such a pivotal role for me to join him at that company. But
that's incredible.
Yeah.
You have a really great early career path story, which involves, I joke, but it's true. You were slinging burritos and coffee over the course of a few years. And why I think this matters so much is because those years were impressionable for you, despite being very typical jobs, right? Tons of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people work in coffee, they work in burritos, grocery stores, whatever. But there were very specific takeaways, both when you worked with Chipotle first in Duluth, and then in this coffee experience that you had in Minneapolis, that seemed to have a direct link to the work that you're doing today. We don't need to go in deep dive into this, but like, what were the kind of the cliff notes of those experiences that you can recall?
Yeah. So Chipotle at the time was so pivotal in my like growth as an employee and as a manager. I kind of worked my way through their training program, and became a manager, and then ultimately helped open up a brand new store in a new market. But Chipotle at the time, and I haven't been at the organization for a really long time, so I can't speak to it today, but at the time had an incredible people culture. They thought of their employees as just fundamentally crucial to the success of the business, because they were what was cooking the food, what was serving the food, and was the customer's primary interaction was with the employees. And so if you couldn't get that right, you were never going to be able to grow and sell more burritos. So they had just a really impressive training model. They really love to promote from within and train people to work up and take over new stores and grow, and worked really well with their business model, which was growing rapidly at the time. And so I think that really taught me a lot about how to value that kind of that most basic, if you think about it in business terms, the most basic unit of your business is so crucial to get right. And if you don't get it right, how can you expect to grow? So yeah, Chipotle and burritos were surprisingly influential on my career path in real estate.
And then coffee was, I want to say it was Tiny Footprint Coffee. Is that correct?
Yep.
You took a sales and marketing role, and I had to ask you, what does that look like in the coffee world? Sales and marketing? Are you going door to door? Are you, making t-shirts, doing cool swag? But you kind of did a little bit of everything, and it ended up being something that sounded like another impressionable, interacting with people, takeaway time period for you. And this is also when that transition started to occur with the U of M real estate class. What was it about coffee that you look back on fondly about at this point when you kind of take a stroll down memory lane?
Yeah. I'll try and answer all of those questions. The first question, what does that even look like as a sales and marketing person? This was primarily a wholesale coffee company. And so our primary customer was other coffee shops who did not roast their own beans, but needed beans roasted for them. And so a lot of the sales and marketing was directly to other coffee shop owners that were either, our current clients or prospective clients. And so that's means we just spent a lot of time in coffee shops, talking to, owners and baristas in individual shops, both from the most high-end, fancy third wave coffee shops at the time, all the way down to your run-of-the-mill, small town Main Street coffee shop. Actually, for a while, we sold to the coffee shop in Winstead.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So
cool.
So kind of, the whole gamut of coffee shops, serving every customer who wasn't driving through a Caribou or a Starbucks. So that was a big part of the role. And I think at Tiny Footprint, it was the pivotal things for me were both getting deeper into an understanding of environmental sustainability from an agricultural perspective and kind of an international agriculture perspective, because coffee is an incredibly sensitive plant and grows at a very specific region. That's why we don't see a lot of it grown here in the US. We just don't have the climate for it. We don't have the altitude for it. So I, in traveling to some countries of origin, um, and not to mention the company itself, the business model was to be carbon negative, hence the name of Tiny Footprint Coffee. So,
Mm.
so it kind of, deepened my understanding in environmental sustainability, but then also watched, a small collective of hardworking people bust their ass to run a small business, like literally wearing every hat every day,
Mm.
accounting to training to sales, to marketing to roasting, to cleaning. At the end of the day, they cleaned up the shop. And so I got a firsthand look at what it means to be a small business owner and wear all the hats
Mm.
on any given day.
Which is very important with what you're doing today. So let's head in that direction. So you pivoted into real estate. I think this was around 2017, sort of officially and formally, and you had this opportunity to work with a firm called Olattis in the Twin Cities area. What was that first opportunity like for you? What was your role in sort of the day to day, week to week at that point?
Yeah. Um, uh, so that was, again, born out of connections I'd made at the University of Minnesota in that urban real estate development class. Um, had an intro made to the president and then the director of government affairs at Olattis, who were kind of working on a special project to try and expand a single family housing initiative that they've been working on for the last few years in the city of Minneapolis. And it was kind of this perfect intersection of the skill sets that I had gained as an undergraduate and my interest in getting into the field of real estate development. So, we were trying to make the argument to the city that, building more single family homes on empty lots was good on a wide array of facets of what makes a healthy city. So we spent a lot of time talking with council members and city staff, other city leaders. We even found ourselves down at the Capitol doing some lobbying when it became time to pass the budget for the year.
Sounds fun.
So it was a very unique first role in real estate development, not a traditional development associate role as some might think of the first entry point. But it was incredibly informative. I learned a lot. I got to sit in on a lot of really important meetings that taught me a lot about how the business worked. I'm so grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah. And that experience dovetailed into a company called Grow, which I believe you spent about 4 years with. And it seems like this was the phase where things really took off for you, got your feet wet, so to speak, and were got your hands in the dirt. So I want to say Grow Dev is the official full name. I know that we've been throwing around the term Grow, but this also linked back to old professors and connections, and not, this lesson I hear over and over with guests is not burning bridges and staying in contact and helping out when you can. And there's just so many of these in your story that I think are great to shine a light on that. So this job came to you by way of an old professor. How did that happen?
Yeah. I mean, it's the same story I told earlier about being in that class and just sticking out like a sore thumb for being so damn serious about wanting to learn about real estate. So the professor had transitioned roles into Grow and was looking for his number two to help build out the real estate department at Grow, which was originally an architecture company, but had expanded to include both interior design and real estate development work.
Okay.
And so him and I spent 4 years looking at thousands of buildings, hundreds of portfolios of buildings. So we largely worked with large nonprofits anywhere in the U.S., and we would really help them assess, analyze, and then optimize their real estate portfolios. We take them through a whole structured process to help them understand where they were today with their real estate portfolio, and truly how much more there was to get from those, what they thought of as often just facilities or buildings, but were in reality also real estate assets to be leveraged and harnessed. And so it was kind of a whirlwind of a job. We were in, the biggest cities, San Francisco, New York, to the smallest little towns in Western Pennsylvania. And, as you start to look at all of these communities, and you spend so much time in them, studying them, learning about them, you start to realize that there's so many similarities between our cities all over the country. Basically, we've just been disseminating ideas about how to build and grow and change. Just kind of all over the country. It just kind of naturally grows and spreads. And so it was fascinating to see that all of these patterns and these building types just kind of repeated all over the country in, different climate zones and with different terrain and different cultures, but with still just the tried and true development patterns that were consistent across America. It was really remarkable.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear how that experience has impacted the work that you're now doing at Good Neighbor Homes. So let's pivot to your company, Good Neighbor Homes. That began, I call it sort of simmering for you in 2020. What was the impetus for the change for you? Why did you say, you know what, I think I want to kind of spread my wings and try to do something on my own?
Yeah. So it was kind of always a goal of mine to be able to do this stuff on my own, kind of be my own boss, and at the time just set my own schedule. I mean, for on the simplest level, but in just before 2020, my father passed away, unfortunately, and that left my sister and I with our childhood home. We both inherited that, and neither of us lived in Winsted at this time. She was out in California. I was here in Minneapolis, and after a few years of learning and planning and just kind of getting my feet wet in real estate, I kind of just get tossed into the deep end with my first house. It was a single house. There's nothing crazy, but it came out of some really unfortunate circumstances. But I was fortunate enough to have my sister trust me to lead a little renovation of the house, get it back into its kind of former glory days, as we would describe it, refinish all the hardwood floors and get a fresh coat of paint on things, and redo the kitchen and one of the bathrooms. And that worked out really well, both for me getting more experience, but also me processing the death of my father. It was very therapeutic to be in my childhood home and to be, demoing walls and bathroom surrounds. So we renovate that and rent that out, and ultimately sell that a couple years later. But that was kind of my, all right, it's time. Let's, here's your first project.
Yeah. And you told me that is a beautiful story, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that to you before, but I have to imagine that the experience of working your way through this home that you lived in for almost 20 years was all the things, like all the emotions that you could imagine.
Yeah.
You mentioned to me that you took a lot of that knowledge and experience from that first project that was sort of by your hands, and you said you aimed to put your money where your mouth was in terms of racial equity, because racial justice and gentrification, these are all topics that you have been thinking about, simmering on, learning about in school, and certainly seen in and around Minneapolis, which you had since moved to. Where does that fit into the thesis or the narrative of Good Neighbor Homes, and how has that been a North Star, so to speak, for the company?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So we sold the childhood home, and took the proceeds from that, and ultimately found myself in a partnership with the Falwell Neighborhood Organization. In the city of Minneapolis, there are hundreds of neighborhood organizations that kind of oversee a small geography within the city, and Falwell was one of them. And there was kind of at this time, and still today, that there was this narrative that white people in a space is inherently bad or inherently gentrifying to a neighborhood. And I had moved to North Minneapolis a few years prior to this, kind of project happening. And I just started showing up to kind of experience that firsthand and learn about it and immerse myself in a new part of the city that I'd never lived in. So I started to volunteer and work for other organizations. I got to know my neighbors. I built relationships, right, with people that I'd never met living on, the south side of Minneapolis in the years that I'd been in the city. I was a whole different community. And a lot of these turned into friendships that I still have today. And kind of over the course of those 3 years, the north side really started to feel like home. And it was, kind of the intersection again of relationships that I'd built with people who were doing similar work. The Falwell Neighborhood Organization, they wanted to purchase this neighborhood corner store building that had been occupied since the 90s by bless her heart, sweet elderly woman who was just living upstairs in one of the 2 apartments up there, and wasn't doing anything with the commercial space. It just was vacant. And so, that building came up for sale and sat on the market for months. Falwell tried to figure out how to buy it, and ultimately the organization was not in a position to make that happen. But they were in a position to become a tenant and kind of be an anchor for that building, and really just to reserve it so that they could do the community work of finding a local entrepreneur from the neighborhood or from the north side generally to start a business in this first floor space. And so I took the proceeds of the sale of my childhood home, bought this building, invested heavily in it, renovated both apartments upstairs, turned the commercial space downstairs into basically a gray shell, just a white shell. Someone can move into it, make it their own immediately, for the neighborhood to do that. That was a 3-year-long project that ultimately ended up in us finding Markella Smith, who opened up the Dream Shop, which is a gift shop on the north side full of a bunch of art, knickknacks, all the classic stuff you think about in a little gift shop. But is all prioritizing north side vendors, people of color, giving them kind of a space to sell their products, a physical store that many of them didn't have. So really cool project. Also taught me an immense amount, but was so gratifying at the end. I say the end, which is sad to say, but I sold the building to my first tenant. So she bought the building. Another Black entrepreneur bought the building from me last fall, and now is the owner of a newly renovated corner store building, which she'll ultimately move her business into, I think, in the long term. So it's really really full cycle on that one.
Yeah, no, that's a really really cool story, and I think it touches on a couple different things, both the development piece and then this unique approach that I would say that you now take to management and managing people and managing tenants and finding the right balance of tenants as well. Um, so let's hop over onto that parallel path briefly and talk
Mhm.
about that unique perspective that you have now brought into managing the management side of properties. And without putting words in your mouth, what would you say that unique approach is with Good Neighbor Homes?
Yeah, yeah. So we do things a little differently. We approach management, property management from, I think, a much more holistic perspective, kind of accounting for more than just simply dollars. So it's an approach that is based in our years of experience doing this, and the industry best practices, which are, I mean, a given at this point. But it's also um, it's kind of grounding ourselves in that human behavior and human psychology. The why and the how of what people do. And so, kind of fundamental to that is, we think when people are cared for, and when they understand your position, as the property manager or as the owner, they're a much more thoughtful, reasonable, and rational person. If, I was thinking of this anecdote earlier. If you've ever been in, therapy, either solo or in a couples therapy session, you've undoubtedly had these conversations with your partner about how to be more thoughtful about, what makes them tick and what makes
Mm,
them happy or upset. Kind of working through those things that you do in your close relationships. We take a similar approach with property management, and this for us means that we oftentimes find ourselves in a more harmonious relationship. One that is mutually beneficial to us both, the manager and the resident. We don't take the typical kind of authoritarian approach to management, where you're making demands and you're laying down the law, and you're not interested in the tenant's perspective, because you have your lease and you have your rules, and you know
mm,
gosh darn it, you need to follow them without question, um, which are all important, no doubt. But we start with the tenant's perspective up front and try and incorporate that into everything that we do. And
yeah.
I know that sounds like a really strange approach for a property management company that you typically think of as someone who's responsible for the building, or for a real estate asset. Um, and we start by taking care of our residents first, our neighbors.
Hmm.
They are the foundational element of a successful real estate business. And we believe if you can't get that right, you can't do right by your tenants, you're always going to be playing catch up. You're always going to be trying to come back from something, and it's a quote I think is overly used sometimes, but is just captures it so well, is the old Paul Wellstone quote, right? Of we all do better when we all do better. Um,
Hmm. I love a good quote.
so yeah,
So true. Yeah, so
it,
true.
it's really simple. It's really basic in a lot of ways, but it is in so many other ways counter to how much of the property management narrative works. Um, and we think that it starts with us as a property management company, as individual employees, right? Like, we also have to be good neighbors, um, and we expect of our residents, from the very first interaction, that they adhere to, what it is to be a good neighbor, and then, you know, over the course of an entire building um, or community, it becomes it kind of rises up to the collective, so that everyone is kind of feeling and taking the same approach um, to the place that they live. ideally long term in kind of a if I'm thinking optimistically about the future, the goal is to kind of um, impart that wisdom and that approach on the overall property management industry, and to see entire neighborhoods made up of people that care about the place they live, that care about the people that live around them, and that we have entire neighborhoods filled with good neighbors.
Yeah.
So we really do think that we can change the way people think about and live in managed properties.
I mean, that was the big takeaway that I had there. What you just sort of touched on is just the way it's done today versus the way it could be done in the future. You look at, gosh, I have to imagine that so many communities and property management companies just go over to the Google reviews really quickly, and you'll see how there is this sort of built-in tension between a renter and sort of the management that you spoke of that dynamic a few minutes ago. And I have to imagine there are better ways to do it, and certainly there are challenges to do that at scale. But I think that's a really great way to approach it. Obviously, it fits so perfectly in with what Good Neighbor Homes means and what it has become as you've started to build it out over the last few years. And speaking of building things out, you have a couple of projects in the works, and obviously right now as we're recording this is mid 2023, and so the real estate market is in a little bit of a unique cyclical position, I'll say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But tell us about the projects that you're working on, what's coming up, and sort of how these management and development mindsets will merge together in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Good Neighbor Homes has 3 good projects that are underway, a few more in the works, but our smallest is just a 4-unit building, on a single city Minneapolis lot. That's also in North Minneapolis, where the previous project that I spoke about with the retail space was centered. It's in the Falwell neighborhood, and it's really a kind of a beautiful trifecta in tackling some of the biggest, urban challenges that we have today. I kind of joke sometimes it's a really small project with really big goals. And so it's the kind of the 3 things, the 3 focuses of that project are, it's going to be net zero ready. So it will produce all of the electricity that it needs to heat and cool and keep the lights on the roof. All of the electricity can be produced on the roof that will power the house year round. Actually, right now we're in talks with a solar shingle provider. I'm sure we've all seen examples of that. We have one here locally, and we're hoping to incorporate that model, that new product, into the development right from the get-go, so that we can say it's not just net zero ready, but it is in fact net zero, because it will be producing electricity on day one.
Interesting.
It's a really fascinating approach. It's also going to be affordable. So for those in the development world, it'll be rent restricted at 50% AMI. So it'll help contribute towards that affordable housing stock that's in the neighborhood already. And then third, it's designed to be a live-work project. So that idea really came from the work that we did next door in that corner store building, realizing that so many of the entrepreneurs in this community aren't ready for a full-blown 2,000 square foot commercial space with $6,000 a month rent. And that's a little, excessive, but what they really need is a much smaller space with much lower barriers to entry that they can, get started in, iterate on, test, fail, in a space that's, both their house and their job. They're not paying two monthly payments. They have the flexibility to kind of to grow and learn and make mistakes that you do as a new business.
I love that. That piece right there seems so important for small businesses and to give the opportunity to small businesses to thrive and find a place and a space to thrive that is not that gargantuan, commercial lease, triple net, XYZ, lock it in for 10 years. I was having a conversation with the group over at Meristem in Texas, and they have the community called Indigo, very large, master planned, but also very thoughtful when it comes to commercial spaces. And they were speaking to something very similar to what you were planning with this project, and that is commercial spaces that are half or less of what they normally are. So the barrier to entry is much lower, which encourages diversity and business, encourages a thriving small business. And I just think it's a great way forward. It's a great way forward.
Yeah. So that's a really sweet project. We're in the kind of city entitlements phase with that one at the moment. Our next is a market rate apartment building in the Linden Hills neighborhood, which is in Southwest Minneapolis. This one is, subject to all the same, struggles of most apartment buildings today. Is it's really difficult to finance it. So this one's probably just going to be put on a shelf for a couple of years. We'll hold the land and wait until the economy's back on the upswing and banks are, feeling good about lending again. And hopefully construction prices have stabilized or maybe even come down if we're lucky. But this will be this will be a great infill project. It's 3 single family lots today that we think we can pretty easily fit 30 to 40 new homes on in a really nice neighborhood with a lot of great amenities, great outdoor spaces next to the lakes in Minneapolis. So really excited to see this one fully get off the ground. But it'll probably be a year or two before we're there. And then in the meantime, in addition to that 4-unit building in the Falwell neighborhood, we are working through some community engagement right now in the suburb of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, which is to the northwest of Minneapolis. We were selected, myself and Damaris Hollingsworth and one other developer were selected to redevelop a parking lot, literally a 7-acre parking lot that used to serve as a park and ride stop for Metro Transit, the bus system here. And so we've got some work ahead of us, no doubt, but the current model is it's a mix of retail and housing, and both for rent and for sale housing. So we'll have some townhomes that will sell, fee simple, and then some apartments that will rent just like normal. Some that'll be affordable, some will be market rate, and then the whole team that we've put together for that is really wonderful, and we've got some really good urban designers that are up and coming and that I think are really going to create an impressive space and place that the folks who live there will cherish for a really long time. Yeah.
That's terrific. And I want to ask this before we wrap up, as it pertains to projects like the Brooklyn Park project, as you look ahead in the coming years of both, development need, societal changes, racial equality, need for diversity. I mean, we were already talking about sort of the smaller commercial spaces and sort of adaptive development projects that think about these things ahead of time. Mm-hmm. What is your personal hope for development or housing, and how are you thinking about progress? Like what is progress to Thomas and to Good Neighbor Homes?
That's a really good question. I think that the first one that comes to my mind is, my God, do I hope that the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, actually materializes and incentivizes developers like myself to build energy efficient buildings. I know that, the name is a little bit of a misnomer, but there was a lot of really good policy in that bill passed at the federal level, so it's going to take some time for it to work its way down. But over the last several years, with the rise in construction costs, it's really squeezed a lot of developments to take a lot of I would call them shortcuts on energy efficiency. I think it's the increased costs have put a lot of pressure on pushing the envelope for more efficient buildings. And so I hope that the IRA can make a real dent at getting and get us back on a path towards buildings that are maybe one day actually, regenerative for the environment rather than purely just another burden. So that's probably my first one. And if anyone, has seen new apartments go up lately, or rather, I should say, if anyone's ever stayed in a hotel, you'll know that the unit that heats a hotel room is now getting rolled out into apartment buildings, the PTAC. And that is, I think, one of the best examples of kind of going backwards in environmental sustainability or energy efficiency. But Chris, probably a second one would, and I'll shut up after this, but I think it would have to be that that the elected officials that we have can really get their heads around the urgency and the importance of a housing first approach to public health. I think we have an incredible gap in what really solid long-term research says is fundamental to someone's stability, and what we're doing today about the affordable housing crisis. So I think for our neighbors that make the lowest income, they face incredible difficulties just meeting basic needs. It's something that you and I probably don't even think about on a daily basis, but it's literally, catastrophic to their lives. So we need more housing for people with very little or no money. And I think that would go a really long way in alleviating so many of the other issues that people experience if they just had stable housing. Yeah.
No, those are two massive points to make, and I'm also cautiously optimistic, and I want to stay encouraged that there will be more lanes for that type of work to be done in the future rather than fewer lanes, right? And I think that's the main thing is
me too.
Opening up the opportunity versus taking it away.
Yeah.
Well, Thomas, it's been so good talking with you and hearing your stories so far. I always like to finish with a couple of rapid fire questions just to get the listeners and viewers Googling and checking out some other resources. So for you, number one is, what have you found as being the most thoughtful project that you've seen in the last year or so from a development point of view? That's not, I always have to say, not one of your own, or not one of your own in the making.
Yeah, I think there are so many people doing much better work than I am out there. It's so humbling. Maybe not the most thoughtful, but I think my favorite project that I think is really pushing a lot of new ground in development is the cul-de-sac development in Tempe, Arizona. It's a big site. It's a full, kind of master plan redevelopment. But it kind of throws out the window all of your typical norms when thinking about a master plan, new community. I mean, it is very dense for an American scale, I should say. It's a totally reasonable density for people. It'll be a great community. The buildings are organized in anything but straight and right angles. It is, the buildings are curved and the courtyards are made up of strange shapes, and I think it's going to be a really lovely community that I think the development team is already planning another one in the suburbs of Atlanta. So I'm really excited about the cul-de-sac development and the cul-de-sac team
Cool.
and what they're doing.
Yeah, I'll definitely make sure that we have that link in the show notes for this episode to take a look at that. I think I've heard of that in recent years, but I honestly have not been back to look at it in a bit. So thank you for that that nod to cul-de-sac. All right, so one book, always a big question, always hard to pick one. But for you right now, what would that book be?
One book, I think it would have to be The Architecture of Happiness. Is what I would recommend. It's Alain de Botton, who's a very intelligent, forgive me, but I think he's a psychologist by training. But his book it's kind of rooted in human psychology and happiness, but also at kind of the intersection of our built environment and what about our cities and our places and our homes truly make us the happiest. It's a really fascinating book. I would put it in kind of the urban geography category. It's not your typical developer book by any means, but
I love it.
It's a really great read.
Some of my favorite recommendations are non-real estate, non-development books, so that's great. Definitely, we'll link that as well. Well, here we are. We're at the end. Thomas, thank you so much for joining me today. There's really only one more thing for me to do, and that is to roll out the red carpet for you. Tell the listeners and the viewers where they can find you, what you're up to these days, and how they can follow up. Yeah,
thanks. Chris, has been really wonderful to chat with you. I appreciate the work that you do with the Transforming Cities podcast. It's important work, and I hope you keep doing it for a long time. But Good Neighbor Homes is still working on their website. So eventually you'll find us at goodneighbor-homes.com. And we'll, I think, put that in the show notes as well. But I'd love to, connect with anyone who's listening and wants to chat more. I would say come over to LinkedIn and send me a message, or find Good Neighbor Homes on LinkedIn and send us a message. And I'd love to connect with like-minded folks.
Awesome. We'll have all these links in the show notes. So definitely feel free to reach out to Thomas, chat more about what we've talked about today, and sure it would be a great conversation to connect. So Thomas, once again, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great.
Thanks, Chris.